There's a difference between happiness and joy. And one of the tragedies of our age is that so many people are in pursuit of happiness, and I don't mean this in the Declaration of Independence way, but pursuit of happiness meaning that kind of dopamine-inducing rush that's cheap in some way. And in the process, they sacrifice joy because in ways that I don't fully understand, joy is often on the other side of pain. It's on the other side of tragedy. And I think that that's something that we don't think about as much. To thrive, to live a rich, deep, fulfilling life, is a life marked by joy, not so much by happiness. Often you will sacrifice joy in the pursuit of happiness, and when you discover that you can't find happiness, you'll be left with true tragedy because you'll become cynical and bitter. And real joy comes on the other side of tragedy, and it's the blending of those two that leads to that richness and ultimately to that joy. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Be Unbound podcast. Welcome back if you've been here before, and welcome for the first time. If this is the first time that you've listened to the podcast, I am your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And today we have the final part of our series that we've been going through, the Adult Framework for Learning: Ask, Do, Understand, Live, and Thrive. Thrive is always my favorite one. Victoria is one of my favorite people. And so we've had two really fun episodes here recently. We got to have an episode with Riley talking about Live and an episode with Victoria talking about Thrive. Victoria's always an excellent guest. She also has this really great ability to ask piercing questions. And in this episode, I'm the one that gets pierced and exposed. And you definitely want to hear that. So stick around, and we hope you enjoy this conversation with Victoria about how to thrive. Victoria Scherter, welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I don't know that you really need welcome, as we just kind of think this is like you walking into the living room more or less here. And so David and I are delighted to be talking to you about this. For those of you joining us, we've been in the middle of this series talking about the Adult Framework of Learning. We use it for Unbound, and it's not exclusive to us necessarily. It's just a way that we kind of use this framework to help design some of our content. And so we're sharing it with you because sometimes it's a helpful way to have a little construct to think about learning. And so that adult is an acronym for Ask, Do, Understand, Live, and Thrive. And as we've talked about, Ask is this questions-based paradigm, the importance of knowing how to ask good questions. And then we sort of flip-flop it a little bit, even though it doesn't work if we spell it that way, and say if you ask questions and it leads you to understand, then you really kind of make that real by doing things. So there's an action component of this. It's you ask questions and you act upon the answers. You understand things and you act to test the hypothesis and to learn those things. And then recently, we just had Riley Moss on here, and we talked about the live part of this, which we can use a couple of different ways, but for us, live is to accept responsibility for your life, to become an adult. The difference between a child and an adult is an adult accepts responsibility. But we wanted to go to this last piece here, and of course, Victoria is an excellent guest for this, which is to say, sure, you've done that. You've accepted responsibility. David in that last episode talked about doing things that are fulfilling rather than fun, which I think is a really cool way to set that up. And that is necessary, and that is a good thing. But it's a good thing not just so you survive. And so I was sharing just before we started that I've observed through my life that when I was going to college, everybody's like, well, enjoy it while you can because they'll be the best years of your life. And the implication was like, it's off to the cubicle farm with you after college. And then when I was a director of admissions, I had so many people come through, mom and dad, with an arm around son or daughter saying, son or daughter, these will be the best years of your life. And I'm like, man, how depressing is that? It's over at 22 or 23. I mean, it's no wonder people are extending and not wanting to graduate from college. And I just fundamentally reject that idea. And so this idea of thrive is to say, okay, yes, to accept responsibility to live is the first step, but we don't want you to just survive. We want you to thrive. And so, Victoria, welcome. We're glad you're here, and we expect you to explain all of that from here on out. So go for it. So.
That's great. No pressure, but I am really excited to be here. I'm excited to get to talk with and also learn from you guys. Always appreciate any chance we get to talk about these things.
So when we are talking about thrive, it's a little bit of an interesting topic for us here at Unbound. We have a tagline that says we train young adults to thrive. And we actually have a definition of that, and it's to accept full responsibility for your life, prioritize relationships, serve others by being extraordinary at ordinary, create value, live resiliently in light of eternity for the glory of God. And, in all modesty, we think that's a pretty good definition. And so we probably will do a whole podcast series on each of those. And so we do mean those things. We don't mean to thrive as just some sort of throwaway word. But honestly, those elements are a way for us to kind of characterize what it means to thrive in the context of our Ascend and other learning programs so that we can make sure that we're helping students to achieve those outcomes. We have to have some measurements to do that. But in this case, when we say thrive, we're maybe pushing it out a little bigger, which is to say what I said earlier. we don't want you just to survive. We want you to be able to lean into and to live richly and live deeply and live in a fulfilling way in this bright, bold, exciting, beautiful life that we've been given, even though it will also be tinged by sadness and tragedy and problems and all those kinds of things. And both of those come together and in some fashion actually create that rich experience that we're talking about. So Victoria, you had some kind of earlier thoughts about that, especially maybe even on the kind of tragedy, struggle type side. So share a little bit of what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the wrestlings that is most poignant in my mind, having not immediately recently, but in the somewhat nearish future, worked through that transition from adolescence into young adulthood, and now maybe what I would consider full adulthood, getting older here. One of the challenges of that as a young person is growing into adulthood without the disillusionment part. And I think that's something that we see in a lot of our peers as you're growing up. It's something looking back that you can kind of see in the young people coming behind you, something that you fight with when you're in the middle of that transition. And you grow up and, depending on the kind of life you've had, the kind of childhood you've had, maybe you've got some rose-colored glasses, maybe you don't. But often what happens is the older you get, the more you realize, man, this is actually really hard. I want to thrive. You have all these visions for your life as a kid or a teenager or even a college student. And then realizing those things ends up being a lot harder than you thought it was going to be, or you encounter many more roadblocks, or just the difficulties and losses of life end up taking a lot out. And so as you kind of wrestle with those things, I remember even just personally trying to figure out, okay, like, man, this is a lot harder. I want to thrive, and I wouldn't maybe put it in those words as a teenager, as a college student, but that's what I wanted. I wanted that kind of life. And yet I was like, but this is also a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. How does that work? And praise the Lord, like the examples I had and the experiences that I had, there were two sides of that. Yes, the world was harder than I thought it was going to be, maybe as a kid or as a teen, but it was also richer and deeper and more beautiful. And so part of, I think, that thriving picture is realizing, yes, things are difficult. And as you grow up, you have to wrestle with that. It's not like we're, saying, oh, thrive and have nothing bad ever happen to you. It's thrive in the context that you now understand. You've asked good questions. You've lived in the real world. You understand those things. But even in that, walking in relationship with God and walking in relationship with other people and knowing these different things allows you to operate in that world in a way that is thriving and recognizes the beauty and the richness of the world that God has given us and the depth of that, and gives us just so much meaning and ability to work and make an impact in that, even as you acknowledge that, yes, there are also difficult things, but we get to thrive even in the midst of that. So it's kind of maybe some rambling thoughts on that, but definitely something that has meant a lot to me as I've worked through that transition myself and wrestled with those things.
Talked about this a couple of times in various places, but I think there's a difference between happiness and joy. Mm-hmm. And that I feel that one of the tragedies of our age is that so many people are in pursuit of happiness. And I don't mean this in the Declaration of Independence way, but pursuit of happiness, meaning that kind of dopamine inducing rush that's cheap in some way. Right. And in the process, they sacrifice joy because in ways that I don't fully understand, joy is often on the other side of pain. It's on the other side of tragedy. It's on the other side. And we see this in the best novels, right? If you think of kind of and I was trying to think of an example earlier, but a sort of a light, fluffy book of some kind, or maybe a Hallmark movie, a Hallmark movie trends well on happiness. And there is something in us that resonates with that. And it's nice to be happy. And there's a happy ever after ending or something like that. But there's something richer and deeper to, Tolkien's works, or even C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories or things like that. There's a deepness and a fulfillment to those that are very much different. And what's the difference? Well, there's often almost always an element of tragedy in the serious works. And I think that that's something that we don't think about as much. To thrive, to live a rich, deep, fulfilling life is a life marked by joy, not so much by happiness. And happiness is fleeting. It's illusory in the sense that you can't fully grasp it anyhow. But often you will sacrifice joy in the pursuit of happiness. And when you discover that you can't find happiness, you'll be left with true tragedy because you'll become cynical and bitter, and you'll think it's all a ruse. It's all, you've been duped in some fashion. Whereas a broader understanding, to come back to our model here, is if you understand the game that's being played, if you understand the reality that's deeper than the surface, is that real joy comes on the other side of tragedy, and to live a full, rich, and thriving life is going to be to take life as it comes and understand there will be parts that will be hard to understand, but we need redeemed, and that there are parts that will be great and you can celebrate right away. And it's the blending of those two that leads to that richness and ultimately to that joy.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up, and I think it's very easy for us to believe that the way that we find that joy, that fulfillment, kind of as we talked about last episode, is by we have this very definite picture in all of our heads, no matter how how much we might not want to admit that, or how conscious that is. I think there's been a bit more leaning into that culturally, of just manifesting your dreams and having all of these very specific goals for your life. And it's not that setting goals is a bad thing by any means. It's not that working towards ambitious things, even things that are more out towards the future, it's not that that's a bad thing by any means. It's just that, especially for those who don't have their hope in Christ, looking at that and having that be your ultimate source of having that be your metric for whether or not you are living a thriving life, whether or not you're making progress towards those things, can be really discouraging, because as we all know, life is not like a Hallmark movie, and life throws curveballs at us, and things don't turn out the way that we dreamed that they would. And we don't end up having exactly the lives that I am willing to bet that the vast majority of us don't have the life that we thought we would have had 5 years ago, even 3 or even 1 year ago. Most of our lives don't look like what we thought they would. And so it's really easy, if you're operating off of that framework, to then just kind of go into this spiral of hopelessness and go, I had just all of my fulfillment and my joy banked on this dream, and now that's gone, and so what am I going to do? And so then that ends up leading into that hopelessness. But if you instead have a perspective of, wait, my fulfillment, my joy does not necessarily come from that. I know that there is joy no matter what sort of circumstances that might come from. That doesn't mean that the hard things that I'm working through right now aren't hard. That doesn't mean that you have to be in a place of denial. It means that you know that ultimately your thriving, your purpose can be beyond that. And so things can turn out differently than what you had dreamed they would be. And that's okay. You can still thrive when things don't turn out the way you'd hoped.
We have a saying in Unbound that, failure is an option, and that understanding that helps you live on the other side of fear. And the idea being that, failure some kind is going to be built into the human experience. And when you accept that, and it's, there's some things you ought not to fail at, keeping your word, for example, things like, where there's some moral things here, but that, you're going to try, and then you're going to fail, and then you're going to try and you're going to fail, and then you're going to try and succeed. And that you can live on the other side of fear when you sort of start to appreciate that. But it is interesting that, there is that fear aspect to it. And I think one of the things that is not immediately apparent, but is interesting in this context of knowing how to thrive and to living this life that is more than just surviving, is that you're going to need an element of fear. And it's for two reasons. Fear will help you move into a place that you haven't been before, where everything's deeper and richer and bigger. Fear will also give you an extreme appreciation for the absence of fear. So my dad used to have this kind of funny joke. He says, why are you hitting your head against the wall? And the guy was like, well, because it feels so good when I stop. And you kind of chuckle at that, right? But there is some aspect of that that's an idiotic thing to do. But there is some piece here that you can't really appreciate the exhilaration of doing something unless you've experienced the fear of failing at doing that thing. And that can be true of all kinds of things. But I was talking to a close friend and a mentor recently, and he said, even when I'd known the deal was good, I've never come to the point of signing a business deal where I didn't have some serious butterflies in my stomach and I was seriously scared about it. And he says, it's just never happened. Even when I'd done all my due diligence and I knew it was a solid deal, stuff like that, he said, there is an aspect that when you sign the papers, when you make the decision, when you decide to do something, you're entering a reality that you're not as good as the one you just left. You knew how to do everything there, and you're entering a new thing. And that's true, take a new job, when you move to a new house, if you enter a new relationship, all those things come with all these extra things. It's like, there's a part of you that's smart enough to know that you don't know what you don't know. and that's going to be a big factor here. And you can't know it until you actually do it. And that one of the things that you don't know might be tragic, might be difficult, might be bad. And yet the exhilaration of doing something you've never done before, the exhilaration of getting to know somebody you've never known before, the exhilaration of succeeding at something you've never tried before, that's powerful, right? But it is powerful because it comes with the risk piece. And so when we talk about thrive, there's an element here of accepting the risk of failure and of knowing that to really thrive means to put yourself in a position where some pain's going to happen, and you know that. Now, you live in a fallen world, pain's going to happen no matter what. So this is an element of understanding that and being able to kind of know that and go through it and then do it anyway. And then to know that ultimately you live in light of a God, of a Savior, of a Christ who's going to make that come out well in the end, even if there's some short-term pain in between.
Well, and just to maybe pull that back to what you gentlemen were talking about earlier on the episode about doing and taking action, I think fundamentally what you're saying, Jonathan, is we weren't called to a life of stagnation. And so anytime you're growing, you're going to face discomfort and failure. That comes with the territory. But the only way to thrive is to experience a life where in some way you are growing and maturing. And I don't mean like, you always have to be discontentedly, going and getting the next master's degree. We're not talking about that, but God didn't make us to just stay stagnant. Like, we should always be growing more in more Christ-likeness and more a better stewardship of the things that He's given to us and all of those different things. So maybe just to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, I think that connects right back to the doing piece. Anytime you're pushing yourself out of your comfort zone and growing, we're going to face that failure and discomfort, and that's worth it for the ultimate goal of honoring Christ and living that kind of life.
So this is going to be like a little soapbox here, so y'all brace yourselves. And David, you might just need to kick it out from underneath me if it goes on too long. But I recently just had a church meeting and with some great dear friends in a dear church. And in it, somebody just remarked, that there's multiple people here who will flat out say, I'm just pew sitters. Don't ask me to do anything. Don't ask me to get involved. I'm just coming to sit in the pew and watch. And that I don't know how to say this as gently as possible. That infuriates me. It drives me absolutely crazy in my mind. And not because I'm like, well, those lazy freeloaders just catching a ride. That's not what I mean at all. It infuriates me because I think, what a colossal tragedy of a life. What a colossal tragedy that you think literally you can come into the presence of God and worship in a church and a family of believers in a place that allows you to do so in a faith legacy in this building that goes back hundreds of years, that you could sit here and think that it would be acceptable to be a pew sitter. Not because I'm mad because you're not participating more, because I'm mad because of all that you're missing, because of all that you are not able to do. And I've actually made myself slightly unpopular at church by saying, if you're sitting in here instead of laying out there, because our church has a cemetery, right? If you're sitting in here instead of laying out here, you've got work to do. And I don't mean that like, hey, get your lazy button gear. I mean that like, hey, what an awesome, amazing, exciting thing. If you are still alive, there is a reason for you to be alive. And from a practical standpoint, from our faith, here's the exciting thing. We get to live, right? Like, if you're alive, there's a purpose, there's a reason, there's a mission for you to do that's fulfilling and that can come with failure and has risks and might lead to tragedy and have some pain and all those things. But yet, how much more exciting is it to live a life that you think matters in terms of there are powerful, important things to do, and clearly the things that you are well equipped to do, because if you're serious about your faith, if you're still breathing, there's still stuff to do. And how tragic to say, I'm just kind of here. I'm just kind of taking space. And I think that happens a lot, but the tragedy of it is piercing to me.
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't kick you off of the soapbox, because I fully support what he said there. And I think the reason that it is so important, and I think also the reason that I think a lot of people miss it is, again, we bring this in, I think just about every episode in this series, is because the reason that it's worthwhile is because we get to do it in the context of community, and we get to do it in the context of other people. When we are looking for fulfillment and when we are looking for ways to find that purpose, that thing to do, that extra depth, there is no better way to do it than to look for how God is calling you to serve your community, to serve other people around you, however that looks like. I mean, obviously, in Jonathan's example, and I think there's a very strong scriptural basis for the fact that a lot of the purpose of the church is for a bunch of other broken people who are looking for that fulfillment, who are trying to live thriving lives for the glory of God, are coming together and saying, how can we do this together? How can we not only help one another? How can we serve each other? But then we can go out and we can serve the rest of our community where we have been placed. And the reason that that's so deeply fulfilling is because there is no other thing on this earth that is going to be eternal other than other eternal souls. If you impact an eternal soul, if you impact another person for the sake of the kingdom, that makes an eternal difference. And because we are inherently eternal beings, that is where that source of just, this is what I am here for, comes from, because we are fulfilling that purpose that our Creator has given us, is to create that lasting change that He has made us for.
Which, to piggyback off of that a little bit, David, it's reminding me of something, Jonathan, you said earlier in this episode about that the parents would come on campus and be like, these are the best years of your life, enjoy this, it's all downhill from here, basically. But just running with that perspective, that also then assumes that you've stopped being able to make an impact, or that impact has become less meaningful the older that you get. And that's the opposite of what we see. Like, when I think about my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents and the honestly, in some ways, deepening influence that those people had in the broader and broader spheres of influence, and being able to do God's work and to share His love with people, that, I don't know, it brings me back to that idea that thriving doesn't end with your college graduation or your graduation from trade school or high school or whatever it is that you're doing, that that involvement in community and those relationships and the way that we can live out loving God with all we are and loving people as ourselves, like, that is something that continues to grow and can become deeper and richer as you continue living a thriving life, not just as a young adult, but also as you go through the years beyond that.
If you're listening to this and you're on the younger age spectrum, right? Or maybe you're a parent to younger folks, maybe just a word of encouragement here, in that, here's my thesis, right? My thesis is, it's going to keep getting better and better and richer and deeper and more exciting every minute that I'm alive going forward, even though it's going to be marked by tragedy and setbacks and all those kinds of things. And then the real story starts. In other words, then I die, and then real reality begins, right? So in that sense, it's good no matter what. I mean, like, I'm expecting a richer, more fulfilling life. And I don't mean that I expect everything to go right. I don't mean that I expect to get out without any pain. I don't mean that there's not going to be tragedies ahead. I just mean that there's going to be richer, deeper, bigger adventures ahead. And so far, that's been true. But also, I know that every minute that goes by gets me closer to the beginning of the real reality. And so that obviously transforms everything. And yet every moment that I'm alive, I have a purpose, a mission, a thing to fulfill. Back to what we said earlier, believe that God has something for us. And my encouragement then is to model that, to teach that, to talk about that, because my thesis is, you have to spend as much time as possible practicing that, to believing that, to saturating yourself with that, because it does get harder to maintain as you get older if things go a certain way. And what I mean by that is that I have the privilege of knowing lots of older people, a generation or two, and I'm not old enough that 3 is now beyond the new reality, right? But a generation or two ahead of me. And there's distinctly two kinds, right? There's a kind that at a certain point checked out. And they said, from here on out, I'm just taking up space. I'm just watching sports. I'm just doing the old person type thing, right? And they talk a lot about what they did before, and they reminisce about it, and there is a tinge and whiff of sadness. But what is always so striking to me is that for those people, I can name others who are their age or older, and in some cases, tremendously older, who are adamantly different. And they are some of them are physically fit, some of them are not. Some of them are, financially fit, some of them are not. In other words, there's no distinction here in terms of how much money they have or how much fitness they have or how much health they have. There is everything about attitude, about, this is where I am, and it keeps getting better. And I might indulge this. It would embarrass her a bit, but if she listens, I won't mind. My mom is a good example of this, and my dad too, for that matter. But my mom has had some significant health problems recently, and she is maybe more aware than she's ever been that her time is likely shorter than longer. And yet, she never stops talking about what they're doing next, and she never stops planning. And her and dad just planted a bunch of trees recently. I mean, just think of that for a second, right? And just, there's always a new project and there's new thing and there's this stuff that she's doing at the church and there's stuff they're doing at this club they're involved with. And there's these things that they're doing here. And then she's talking about the grandparents and stuff like that. And, we've had some serious conversations recently because she just had another health scare and praise God, it was not cancerous. The test came back. But, and she was basically like, yeah, it's possible that this is really short. And if that's the case, okay, I'm ready to go. But if not, I want to be ready. I want to be ready for this next thing. And it is a marked contrast to folks I know who are, 10, 15, maybe 20 years younger than her that have far less health problems who have basically said, yeah. And so I think it takes practice. And so it's my encouragement that it starts with just a simple thought. You're not here to survive. You're here to thrive. There is that you should have an expectation of exhilaration. You should have an expectation of more. You should have an expectation of growth. You should have an expectation of challenge, and you should have an expectation of richness as you go forward, knowing that richness, that joy, that growth is going to be mixed with hard things.
Yeah, that's such a powerful example. And I've seen a lot of that too in people of various ages and stages of my life. And I think just the people who are willing to fully embrace and lean into the phase of life that God has put them in is just so it's just that difference that you're talking about, Jonathan. And just there's some of them who I think the ones that I've seen that end up struggling the most seem to just always be pining for their younger days, or for those who are on the younger end, just when I get past this, when I get to this point, when I finally achieve whatever that next thing is that they're looking for. And it's just this dissatisfaction that they're just looking either forward or back to when things will be better. And it's just such a difference between that versus those who are just looking and saying hey, maybe there are some things that were better or worse, or will be better or worse, but I'm going to take this life, this opportunity, these people, these gifts that God has given me here now, I'm going to use them to the fullest. And yeah, the people who do that are, I think, some of the most inspiring to me on a day-to-day basis.
Jonathan, I'd be curious to follow up with a question from your experience for somebody who's in the middle of trying to constantly choose thrive over survive. Perhaps they're in the middle of just a day-to-day slog, or there are just repeated issues and the teenager keeps acting up and is making bad choices, and you're beating your head against the wall, to refer back to your earlier analogy. Or maybe you're someone's caretaker, or maybe you're in the throes of dealing with a broken system. It's something, I know, Jonathan, you've had to deal with the foster care system a lot. Is there encouragement or perspective? How would you encourage somebody to continue looking at that and choosing the thrive piece when sometimes it just feels like you're just in the slog of just trying to survive day to day?
David, I don't know why we thought we'd get Victoria on the podcast without getting a piercing coaching question that got right to the heart of it, and also just got all the things. So Victoria is laying me bare here. I can answer this because I just failed colossally at it. I can answer this because I lost sight of this, and I had to struggle to come back out of it. And Victoria didn't necessarily know that when she asked the question, so just so y'all know. So I just had a conversation with a mentor who said something really powerful to me that I should share with you because it was really, really meaningful, and it's had impact. Yes, you're going to get in those situations where the struggle is intense, and this idea of thriving seems almost laughable, and you'd really just like to be out of the particular season that you're in. And I was in a season like that and was kind of feeling overwhelmed by it, was doing none of the things we're talking about here. Let me just be really clear. Okay. So the things we're talking about, I'm telling you from hard-won experience, but not success. Sometimes success, but not always, right? Despite my mother's great example. And this mentor told me, he said, I've been in these work situations where I have these constant challenges all the time. And at a certain point, I was like, why do I keep facing these constant challenges? My wife is like, because that's what you're supposed to do. That's what you're good at. And he said, then I heard a pastor preach in a sermon recently, and he said, for 20 plus years, I was always like, when we fix this problem, do some real ministry. When we get this thing fixed, some really cool things are going to happen. When we get this thing fixed, the church is really going to grow. And he says, and then I realized, and I had to confess and fall on my knees and say that the obstacles were my ministry. The way that I dealt with those problems, the way that I resolved those problems, it wasn't the impediment to my ministry. it was actually the real life there, and that there were always going to be those of different kinds. And and to some extent, you pray you get different ones, but there's going to be those. And my mentor said, so this thing you're facing now, you might need to face the fact that these challenges are what you do. And my response was, that is the least encouraging thing you can say to me. Like, this is not what I want to hear. You're telling me that this thing I'm messing with is going to be permanent? Like, I mean, that's kind of the implications you're saying there. And so I answer you, Victoria, and say that that's totally a struggle, but also the only way I know to really get to some true level of rich life is to be able to practice that and to really understand that at a deep level, what my mentor said there. And because in doing it, two things will happen. You'll have an immediate thing to do. This isn't like something you work on later. It's now immediate present right here. It will have immediate rewards as you'll get kind of micro victories in that. And then all those stitches together will make the whole tapestry. But you don't get to the whole tapestry without those little things. In other words, you don't grit your teeth, close your eyes, cover your ears, and hold your nose and survive the tragedy and get to the other side and say, oh, great, now I'm thriving. You have to get dirty. You have to get hurt. You have to bleed. You have to sweat. You have to cry. You have to go through that moment by moment, piece by piece, bit by bit. And in every tragedy in my life, that's been true. And I've found myself saying things, I know this is a little off of your question, Victoria, telling people that, when you come to those places, and especially when you come to places to mourn, you want to skip that. And I tell people, this is going to sound weird. I don't want to say to enjoy the mourning, but I want you to experience the full experience of mourning. You should lean into that, and you should embrace the pain. Not like in some weird, like I want to suffer way, in some like, this too is a richness of human emotion. And to fully understand everything else about being human, you're going to have to understand this as well. And the encouragement is, it is not a permanent state. And then another mentor within 24 hours said, you've already survived all the worst days you've ever had, which is stupid and profound at the same time, right? I mean, it's like one of those like, well, actually that's got, so, I mean, but those things together are pretty interesting, right? That the obstacle in front of you is your ministry, is your mission, is what you're doing. And you've already survived all the worst days you've ever had. The second provides perspective and context for the former. The latter provides perspective and content for the former. And holding those together does give you a bit of rope on how to live, even in the middle of hard things. And if you live well in the hard things, to our earlier point, the joy will be richer, the satisfaction deeper, and the perspective and understanding of who God is ends up increasing dramatically, in my experience. Saying is one now who's struggling to do the very things I'm telling you. So I'm making no claim of expertise here, more of I have an understanding of this a little bit better, having just failed spectacularly at the thing I'm talking about.
I really appreciate that. Thank you for sharing.
I don't know, David. I'm tempted to end this podcast before Victoria asks me another question and lays me bare in front of the mic here. So, Victoria, it is, all joking aside, it is always a privilege to have you on. And in case you're all wondering, yes, Victoria asks questions like this all the time, which is why she is such an important person in our life and plays such a pivotal role in everything we do at Unbound. And in fact, plays a pivotal role in each of our lives personally as well. And we hope and pray that you have people like that in your life as well, harkening back to David's comment about having community. And more than that, we hope that this podcast gives you some things to think about, hopefully some transparency and some humility about the people that are talking always don't know and how to practice the things they're talking about. And I hope you never thought that before, but if you did, I hope we put that to rest. And that we do, though, want to call you to something that I think we've been called to as well, and we struggle as well, which is you're not here just to survive. You are here indeed to thrive, which is to live this rich, fulfilling, deep life that has purpose and meaning and makes a difference in the world. And it doesn't matter what you're doing, that is available to you. And if you're sitting in the church instead of laying outside, there's still purpose and there's still meaning and there's still things for you to do. Thanks so much for listening. And Victoria, thanks for being here. All right, David, I've confessed. What have you got to confess at the end of this episode?
Listen, I'm afraid I'm not going to take quite the high road that you took in just confessing the failings. I'm just going to confess that I just have learned a lot about the adult model and just how it can apply to different areas of my life. This is just something that obviously we work with pretty much day in and day out at Unbound, but I think that I've just found it really helpful and just really applicable in just a lot of things that are not Unbound in my life, and especially just tying it all together with Thrive. It's been such a pleasure and just such an encouragement to just see how worth living life is when looked at in the context that God has laid out for us. And so I'm just here to say I've just been really encouraged by this whole series, and I really appreciated it.
Well, what a fun thing to be able to sit and to think about these things, to talk about them. When you talk about them, when you talk with other people, when you have a conversation, there's so much to learn. And I can say the same thing, David. There's been a lot of learning that's taken place. One of our favorite quotes around here is all models are wrong. Some models are useful. And so, keep in mind that this is not an infallible model. We're not saying that this is, the keys to the fabric of reality here. And we're not saying that this is in any way comparative to the capital T truth that you'd find in Scripture and revealed in that way. But we do think it's attached to some of those things, that it is derived from some of that, and that its purpose is a perspective-giving device that helps you see some of those greater truths. And if that's the case, then it's useful and use it. And if it's not, then disregard it. And so we hope that you've enjoyed this series. We hope that you've, like David and I, learned some stuff along the way. And if you've listened to all of them, we really appreciate it. What a privilege to be able to share what we've learned. In so many ways, you've heard us talk about this so much, we get to work with these extraordinary students, and we get to work with an extraordinary staff, and we get to do something that we really care about. That is not common necessarily. And I think each one of us sort of pinches ourselves each day and can't believe that we're able to do this. And I don't know, speaking for myself, I am keenly aware of how incompetent I am. I'm keenly aware of how underqualified I am for this. And so every day just seems like a privilege. And we get to learn these things. We get to see these things. We get to talk to these people. It just feels like we've just got this burning desire and passion to be able to share it in a way that helps others. And so we hope that indeed doing that was helpful to you. And so thanks for your participation. Thanks for listening. If these things make sense to you, if you're interested in them, if you want to learn more, you can go to beunbound.us to learn about them, and especially about the programs that we offer for high school students and our post-high school programs. And we'd be delighted to include you in our ongoing journey. And maybe you'll be some of those people that inspire us, teach us, and get us to pinch ourselves every morning and go, I can't believe I get to work with students like that. And if that would be you, go to beunbound.us and enroll as soon as possible so we get to meet you soon. And until next time, be unbound.